Hello and welcome back to episode 2 of Charlie.inkspired. And you may have noticed some new intro music or a new intro if you're watching YouTube. So I just have to a huge shout out to Simon Pitt. Simon is a musical genius and a legend and has done so many documentaries and incredible work. So I was completely honoured when he approached me and offered to do this for me. So massive shout out to Simon. Make sure you go follow him. I will credit him down below. Firstly, I just want to give you guys a shout out for all the lovely messages and support that I've been receiving since announcing that I am coming back to podcasting and starting this adventure in YouTube. YouTube is pretty new for me, so I'm still trying to find my feet, and there were a lot of errors in the first episode, and that's fine because this is a learning journey for me. It's a very different process from spending 20 minutes recording like 15 different TikToks that are like 30 seconds long. Like, this is sitting down and being vulnerable and expressing your opinions and talking about really like intense subjects. So I feel really vulnerable doing this, but it's also, really wonderful that I have the opportunity to do so. And you know what? I'm actually intrigued to see where you came from. Have you just discovered me on YouTube? Are you coming over from Spotify? Are you coming over from my band page Adama? Small little plug there. Are you coming over from Instagram or even TikTok? Comment below. Where are you from? What's brought you here today? So I did actually find it quite funny last week when I shared on TikTok that this is going to be what I'm doing and the reason why. Like, I announced that I used to work for the police, and a lot of the TikToks were like, "Oh, I thought you were cool. You were just a fed." No, I was never a police officer, although officer was in my title. I worked in the contact centre. I appreciate people don't have the best opinion of the police and they are automatically going to assume something about you when you say that you worked for them or you work for them, and everyone's entitled to their opinion and everyone has their unique experiences with that. I just think it's really funny that people always assume that it's a bad thing, and I can understand why they do, especially given the context of last week's episode. I don't blame you at all. But I wanted to touch on that in today's episode to say that I'm actually really proud of the work that I did when I was in the police. I worked really hard and I wanted to help. That's why I joined. I wanted to make a difference because I could see some injustice within the system and, everywhere in the world. And I'm still to this day really proud. I trained hard and I saved so many lives. I was that soothing voice at the end of the phone when they were in the worst moments of their life. And they don't know who I am. They will never know it was me, or they will never, piece those two things together. But I remember a lot of the calls that I dealt with. And I was there for 9 months. I took a lot of calls. But, I hope that some of them may think actually the experience that I had with this specific call handler was really reassuring, and she made me feel safe. She made me feel heard. And if I've done that, then I've done a good job, and that's all I can ask. So yeah, I'm never going to apologise for putting something good out into the world, because I'm a firm believer of you get out what you put in. Okay, let's talk about the elephant in the room about last week's episode really, really quickly. There were a couple of issues that I came across. So first and foremost, audio. As soon as I started editing the video, I realised that my audio just stopped recording 2 minutes in, which is fantastic. So I actually had to go off the audio of my phone in last week's episode, hence why the quality isn't great. However, I have fixed the problem and the audio should be better this time around, so that's great. If you tuned into last week's episode on YouTube, you will see that there was some weird colour grading thing going on. I don't know what happened there, but it did, and it wasn't until, I exported it or uploaded it to YouTube that actually I realised that the colour grading was way off and it was too late to do anything about it. So I'm completely new to kind of editing long videos like this, and I'm using a completely new software that I've never used before, so just bear with me, and if you stick around you'll get to see growth in that department, and yeah, isn't that wonderful? Very quickly, I want to plug something for you. No, it's not an ad. I'm not being sponsored. I'm not quite there yet, don't worry. It is 1 week until my next single, Hush Hush, comes out with Adama, and I'm really excited. So I will drop the pre-save link down below in the bio if you can go and pre-save that. Or if you are listening after the 16th of February, you're too late to pre-save, but you can go and stream it. There is a really intense music video. I'm going to warn you about that. It's very intense, but it's my most vulnerable music video yet, which is saying something. Or you can just go listen to the audio. It's a very angry song. Surprise, surprise. But yeah, it would mean the world to me if you headed over to Adama to go check that out. And one thing I thought was really topical that happened this week that I really want to touch upon before we get into this week's case. The Independent newspaper released an article about, surprise, surprise, the Metropolitan Police. So apparently some body cam footage was being reviewed by an officer where she discovered some interesting comments were being made. And these comments were about a female who, as far as I have been able to see in this report, she'd been detained in a police van for assault, but she'd also been assaulted. So she was a victim as well. We're not quite sure on the details of this just yet, but she was in the back of this police van and actually having a seizure. And during this seizure, comments were made of a sexually explicit nature. And the comments didn't just stop there. Apparently, when this female officer was reviewing the body cam footage and came across this, other male officers came over and asked to see her groin area or commented about other parts of her body that were just totally inappropriate. And they actually referred her by first name, so they knew who she was as well, which is a creepy thing to think. I just wanted to touch on that. I will try and find the article and link that below if I can. But yeah, I thought it was really topical considering last week we covered so many issues with the London Met, and that case was only 4 years ago. So it's interesting to see that it's very much still present today. Are we surprised? No. We saw how they handled the Sarah Everard case. Yeah, but just throwing that out there. And just to warn you that this week's episode will not put any trust back into the police either. So this week we're going to delve deep into another horrific story. This case is a little bit older than last week's episode, but it's still very close to the UK's heart. And again, the story this week is going to take us across so many different topics of different religions, race, culture, everything. So we're going to delve into that and, do some detective work, let's say. So before we get into that, I just want to say a disclaimer that I mean no harm nor disrespect to anyone involved in this case, whether that be the victims or the victim's family. Everything is researched by myself and myself only, with the research that is already available online. There's actually a documentary on this week's case that you can go and watch on YouTube, which is called A Love Story. This case contains details of violence and murder, so if you're not in the headspace for that right now, please pause here and go do something for yourself and come back next time. Not that, next time's probably going to be that much lighter. But yeah, look after yourself. I'd rather you look after yourself than push through and end up triggering something. And lastly, I do put my opinions into the cases that I research, and I want to make it clear that when I put my opinion across, it's a very researched and rounded opinion. I try not to come at it from a biased perspective. I do my research, try and find both sides of it, and then I input my life experiences into it. That is my opinion and my opinion alone. You are completely allowed to disagree, and that is a-okay, but I'm also allowed my opinion. And before we get into this, let's take a deep breath. Okay. Today we are covering the case of Banaz Mahmod. Banaz was born in 1985 in Iraq to her father Mahmud and Baya Mahmod. Banaz was one of 6. She had one older brother and 4 other sisters, both younger and older. Banaz and her family moved to London in 1995 to escape the reign of Saddam Hussein, because at that point in time over in Iraq, things were starting to get pretty ruthless, because at this time in 1995, the first presidential election under Saddam Hussein was starting to occur, I guess is the right way to put it. So they fled to the UK in hopes of a better life and to be generally less oppressed. Banaz was 10 years old when she moved to the UK. She was described by one of her sisters and teachers as calm, quiet, and nurturing. Apparently, she really didn't like arguments or conflict. Banaz even got herself the nickname of Naska, which literally translates to softness, which I really think is testament to the character that she was. The fact that people can describe you, but to base a whole nickname off of how much of a good person you are and how kind you are, I think that says a lot. Banaz had hazel eyes and a heart-shaped face. She was completely beautiful, and she looked kind and soft and just really lovely. Her sister Bekhal actually says in the documentary, I could stare at her forever. She was so beautiful. And whilst Banaz and her sister Bekhal had a really good, loving, supportive relationship, things were far from peaceful within the Mahmod household. From a young age, the girls of the Mahmod family were controlled and abused by their father. And not just their father, but we'll get onto that in a second. Every single detail of their lives were completely controlled. They weren't allowed long nails, perfume, or to do anything to alter their appearance, like pluck their eyebrows. But this story goes a lot deeper than the abuse of one single family member. The Mahmod family were Kurdish, where historically women in these communities are excluded from public life, to the point where they were banished from marketplaces and even killed if they were spotted there. And this tradition from like the 15th century continued despite developments in equality everywhere else in the world. In fact, in Iraq, it wasn't until 1958 where the Union of Kurdish Women lobbied for legal reform in Iraqi civil law. And in 1958, they succeeded in bringing marriage under civil control and abolishing honor killings. But in 1988, Kurdish women were kept in concentration camps where rape was used as a form of punishment. And that is just a slight insight into the history of this. It's a long, complex history of Kurdish culture, but we wouldn't be here discussing this case today if it wasn't important. And one way that Banaz and her 3 other sisters were abused were through a form of sadistic ritual of female genital mutilation, but we're going to call it FGM for short. And I say sadistic not because of its religious beliefs, because it's got absolutely nothing to do with Satan. I just can't personally bring myself to describe it as anything else. And if you're lucky enough not to know what FGM is, I'm about to burst that bubble for you. FGM includes the removal of parts of a female genitalia, and that can range all the way from labia to clitoral hood. Girls, and I mean girls, aged 0 to about the time they start to hit puberty, around 10, 11 years old, are forced into this, often without hygienic equipment, doctors, or any anaesthetic in the slightest. In a lot of cases, the vagina is actually sewn up, leaving the smallest hole for fluid like menstrual cycle and urine. This is purely done to control women's sexuality, with concepts of modesty and purity being thrown in there. And it goes without saying that this procedure can be fatal, ranging from sepsis to blood loss. And if you think this only happens abroad, oh no, you are wrong. FGM wasn't made illegal in the UK until 1985, where it carries the very long sentence of 5 years. So back to the case. In the documentary that I mentioned earlier, Banaz's sister Bekhal is incredible. She speaks with such honesty and bravery about the torture that she had to endure as a child. She tells us about a time that she looked into her father's jacket pocket and found a blade and a bottle of alcohol. Later that same day that she found these items, she heard one of her sisters screaming from the room upstairs, where she walked in to find her sister on the floor, stripped from the waist down, surrounded by her father, uncle and cousins, and they were cutting chunks of her genitalia off and pouring alcohol into her open wounds. It's an uncomfortable topic. We can't avoid that it's uncomfortable, but it still happens today, so it's something that we have to talk about. And actually, only the youngest of the Mahmod family didn't experience this. And sadly, Banaz was mutilated in this horrific way. And this happened in the UK. The men of the family controlled everything. And whilst Banaz's uncle Ari was actually younger than her father Mahmod, he was kind of the head of the family. He held all the authority because he was successful and wealthy. But why did they control everything? Let's look into that. Traditionally, in communities and cultures like this, the surname or the family name is like a brand. And it was the men of the family's responsibility to make sure nothing or no one ruined that reputation. And the thing that most often brought shame onto the family was the women of the family. So essentially, these men controlled their family dignity through the women. And women were most often seen as the cause for this because of their sexuality. If they were to have sexual relations with a man that they weren't married to, that would bring shame. Or even, as simple as saying no to a man would also bring shame. And if shame were brought onto a family in such a way, the community would start to completely shut them out, where traditionally they'd be, banned from trading, shopping, or socializing. They weren't able to do anything, like they were completely shunned and cut out. So because of all of this, women in their culture are completely surveillanced all of the time. And I mean all of the time. And if shame is brought on by a woman in the family, the way they deal with this is believed that the only way to revive the honour to the family is to remove the dishonour or the shame and therefore restore the honour. An honour killing. But we'll get more into that in depth later. And when the Mahmod family moved to the UK in 1995, the men really struggled to adapt because Here in the UK, women are pretty equal to men, especially in marriage. They have completely equal rights. And I think that's something they really, really struggled with coming to terms with, because it was a complete culture shock to them. And if your culture, in that sense, is so embedded into your identity and the shame that's brought upon you, it's going to be a difficult transition. And a way it's described in the documentary, I think, is really fascinating, that men are gold and women are silk. If you were to drop gold into a puddle of mud, you could wash that piece of gold and it would still be worth a lot of money. Whereas if you dropped some silk into mud, it would be stained and useless. Now that we've learned a little bit about that, let's get back into the story. And we're actually going to start a bit with Bekhal today. Bekhal is actually still in hiding to this day because of the constant fear that she lives in from her family. And while she was growing up, Bekhal actually ran away from her family multiple times, just in an attempt to escape her father, her uncle, her cousin's abuse. And this angered her father, Mahmod. It gave the impression to the community that he couldn't control her, or he had no control over his family. So therefore, it put shame onto the family and also to him and his status as a man. So in 2002, he tried to restore the honour. When Bekhal left home, she kept in touch with her older brother. And one day her brother convinced her to meet him, to come out of hiding, to see him, to speak to him. And she trusted him. She had no reason not to trust him. He hadn't shown any behaviour to suggest otherwise, They met on the street where he handed her a suitcase and told her to walk ahead. And as she did what he said, he then hit her over the head with a dumbbell and wrapped his arm around her throat in an attempt to choke her. But Bekhal actually managed to bite his arm, which caused him to let go, where she turned around and screamed at him, "Stop! Look what you're doing. You're trying to kill me." And much to her surprise, he completely broke down and started crying. He wept to her and said, "I'm sorry. I'm the man after Dad goes. I have to do this. I have to put the shame to an end." So it was here that Bekhal actually found out that her father had paid her brother to kill her. So Bekhal went back into hiding and laid low to try and play it safe. So it won't come as a surprise to you that arranged marriages are also a huge thing in this culture. And by the age of 17, Banaz was married. Banaz was married to a man named Ali, who was fresh off the plane from Iraq. He was also completely illiterate. Ali, unsurprisingly, was 10 years her senior and had very, very traditional views when it came to their culture and the status within a marriage. But Banaz's father, Mahmod, took pride in this arrangement. He spoke so highly of his son-in-law. After all, he'd found her a traditional Kurdish man to marry. So at the tender age of 17, she moved into Ali's house, where she was completely isolated from her family and just shut off, and that was it. Not that her family were particularly great to her to begin with, but still, I can't imagine at 17 years old being suddenly married to a man 10 years older than you and you have no one around you. But the one person who was continuously good to her was her sister Bekhal. And not long into their marriage, Banaz went to go visit her sister to speak to her, where she revealed to her sister that she was actually in an abusive relationship and she was in a lot of danger. And the information that we know about this domestic violence, we actually know from Banaz herself, because Banaz went to the police multiple times. Like I said earlier, guys, it's episode 2 and we already have a second case where London Met Police royally messed this up. So, skipping ahead slightly in the timeline, we're in October 2005. Just 2 years after Banaz and Ali got married, they were separated, and Banaz went to the police to report her ex-husband for this abuse, where she spoke to a female officer and explained, "My husband, he thinks like 50 years in the past." She said he was strict and that whenever he wanted sex, it was his way. He wouldn't take no for an answer. She said she tried to stop him, but he would slap her and pull her hair. She goes on to say that he threatened to kill her if she told anyone. So she locked herself in the bathroom and just cried. She said, "I was just 17 and he acted like nothing had happened. It was like I was his shoe and he could wear me whenever he wanted. And he made me believe that my family loved him more than they did me and that nobody would help me even if I asked for it." And this is such a heartbreaking part of it because he's kind of right. As we go on to learn about this, her family weren't going to do anything to help her. She goes on to tell the female officer about an example of a time where they had guests over, and in their culture, a wife is not supposed to address her husband by first name. And when they had guests over, she accidentally did this. And as soon as the guests left, he threatened her with a knife. Banaz tried to make it clear to her husband at the time that they live in the UK and we are seen as equals, but he didn't believe that. And to be honest, I don't think he was ever going to accept that, no matter where in the world he was. Sadly, it doesn't stop there. Banaz told this officer that she kept a diary and photographs of the wounds, but her husband found it. And not only did he destroy the evidence, but he beat her within an inch of her life. He kicked Banaz in the head until her lips and ears and nose and everything was bleeding. And since this, Banaz had experienced a lot of memory loss because she'd been beaten in the head and she never received any medical treatment for the injuries that she suffered from her husband. And it's so disappointing to say, but the police did absolutely nothing with this report at all. But I promise we're going to come back onto that later. So, back onto the timeline. Banaz is still married to Ali and she'd mentioned to her sister that he was abusing her. This got back to the Mahmod family, where Mahmod actually confronted Ali about the abuse. He said, "Are you abusing my daughter?" And Ali said, "Yeah, I abuse your daughter, but only because she speaks back to me." Where Ali says, "Yeah, I abuse your daughter, but only because she speaks back to me and says no." And her father took this as an acceptable reason. So nothing was done. Unsurprisingly, Banaz was desperate to leave her husband Ali, and she knew that she was in danger and that she needed to get out. And she actually ran back to her parents' house multiple times, but the community started to notice this seemingly failing marriage, where the family, and when I say the family, the men of the family were forced to hold a meeting to discuss how they were going to deal with this. Because people were starting to talk, and when people talk, it's usually not about a good thing. So they came up with a plan, and the plan was that Banaz was to return to her husband and be a good wife. Stop saying no, stop being disrespectful. And under the order of her family, Banaz did go back to her husband, where she tried to just do what he said and stay safe, but I really don't think that she could have done anything to stay safe in that situation. And one night she made him dinner, and as he was sat there eating this dinner, he looked at her and said, "Look at you, so skinny, so ugly. You're nothing but a whore." And Banaz had had enough. She rang her mother straight away and said, "I want a divorce no matter what. This is it." So she packed a small bag and left. And when she left, she knew that this was the worst thing she could do in the eyes of her culture, community, and family. And I just want to commend Banaz here, because the most dangerous part of any domestically abusive relationship is the part where the victim leaves. The chances of them getting killed jump up as soon as they leave, because that's it. The abuser has then lost the power and the control. So that, coupled up with the fact that her family, her community were completely against this as well, it shows testament to how brave she was as a person and how much she wanted to separate herself from these outdated beliefs. So now that Banaz was separated from her husband, she was living back with her family. And whilst she sought some comfort there, she was far from safe. But not long after this separation, Banaz met Ramat. And in Ramat, she found joy, happiness, and freedom. This relationship developed quickly, where they planned to be together and have children, and they even picked out the names for these children. And after Banaz's death, police found hundreds of texts between Ramat and Banaz where they were just so in love. Every day a good night text, every day a good morning text, and they were just exchanging such support and love for each other. So I really take comfort in the fact that she did have someone who loved her. But at the time, Banaz did her absolute best to keep this relationship a secret from her family, because that on top of a divorce, not going to be good. So in our timeline, we're now at the point of October 2005, the same point where Banaz goes to the police station to report her ex-husband for abuse. But domestic violence from her ex-husband wasn't the only thing that Banaz reported that day. Banaz told the police officer that she is being followed by multiple men in her community. She knew that men were being sent by her family to watch her, keep tabs on her, see what she was up to. Here Banaz says the very striking sentence, "If anything happens to me, I want you to know it's them." Yeah, that's heavy. She knew from this point when she was speaking to the police how much danger she was in, and she risked everything to report this. If she had been spotted speaking to the police, can you imagine the shame that this would have brought onto the family, that not only did their daughter go through a divorce, which is against their culture and their beliefs, but she's actually going to the police to speak about everything too. So again, testament to Banaz. She absolutely stands her ground, and I'm so proud of her for that. So let's fast forward a little bit to December 2005. And this is 2 months after she reported everything to the police. And Banaz was being followed by her family. And it was in December 2005 when she was spotted with her boyfriend Ramat kissing outside Morden Tube Station. And this information was fed back to her father and her uncle immediately. The men held another meeting where they came up with a plan, where her father, Mahmod, decided enough is enough. The shame needs to be removed from the family. And on New Year's Eve in 2005, Banaz was ordered to go to her grandmother's house, where she was told to bring a suitcase. And I don't know what this is about the suitcase, but it seems to be a bit of a theme, as we saw earlier with Bekhal, but again, we'll touch a little bit on suitcases later. So she carries the suitcase into her grandmother's house, and her father handed her a glass of brandy and told her to drink it and sit down. So Banaz did what she was told. She drank the drink and she sat down. She was then told to look straight ahead and not turn around, but Banaz did turn around, where she saw her father approaching her wearing medical-grade gloves, and he was going for her throat. Banaz managed to run away in a struggle where she spotted that the key was in the back door and ran out. She escaped through the garden and ran to her neighbour's house, where she plunged her arms through a glass pane in an attempt to get their attention. You don't do that unless you are in absolute fear for your life. Her wrists were completely sliced and she was bleeding heavily. Unfortunately, this didn't get the neighbour's attention. I don't know if that's because the neighbour wasn't in or the neighbour ignored this. Not sure. But Banaz ran down the road, where eventually she passed out from blood loss, and she collapsed on the street, where a passerby found her and phoned an ambulance, and she was collected by an ambulance. The hospital phoned her boyfriend Ramat to comfort her, and Ramat actually filmed Banaz in the hospital and asked her, "What happened? Tell me what happened." He wanted her to have any form of evidence to, get this evidence as quickly as he could. He was doing a great job here, and you can actually go view this footage. In this video, she explained to us a little bit about what happened. She says, "I drank something that I'd never drank before. He went out the room and he came back in, but he was wearing gloves. He told me to sit down. I saw the key in the door, so I unlocked it and I ran." And this video of her describing this is not a pleasant one at all. You can clearly see that she's not doing great during this video, whether that's from trauma, bloodlust, or whatever she drank. We don't know what she drank, whether that was just alcohol or whether she was drugged as well. We don't know. But it's vital at this point to tell you that, once again, Banaz was not believed by the police. Obviously, officers were called to the hospital as soon as the nurses heard this story, where a female officer took Banaz's statement, but she didn't believe her. This officer thought Banaz was just drunk and making up a story for fun. I try not to say specific opinions about people during these, but I hope this officer doesn't go a day without thinking about this, because it wasn't her job to believe. It's an officer's job to take a statement and follow through with a report. You are supposed to be victim-led. And if a victim is reporting that she, was nearly killed by her father, you do whatever you can to keep her safe. But no, this officer did the worst job of that. So Banaz left the hospital and went to initially stay with her boyfriend Ramat, but her family forced her to return home. And once she was back home, this female officer from the hospital paid a visit to take another statement. And not only did this officer not believe Banaz, she did something even worse to put her in danger. This officer physically told Mahmod what his daughter was accusing him of. But the strong woman that Banaz was, she stuck by her story. She gave the same statement to this officer in front of her family. She stuck by the truth and she stood up for herself in attempt to convince this officer that she was in danger. And with everything that had happened in the last few weeks, Mahmod was angrier than ever. Not only had he now failed to kill his daughter and take the shame away from his family, she was going against him and reporting him to the police. So with that, surprise, surprise, there was another family meeting where the men of the Mahmod family came up with a plan. Here, Banaz's uncle Ari and her father Mahmod gave an order to the younger men of the family, where they said, "What I want you to do is kill Banaz." We're going to skip a little bit ahead. On the 25th of January 2006, Ramat hadn't heard from Banaz, and he reported her missing on this day. He hadn't received his normal good night text the night before. He hadn't received a good morning text. He heard nothing. Complete radio silence. And immediately he knew something wasn't right. And this is where Detective Caroline Good was assigned to the case of Banaz's disappearance. And I just want to say we love Caroline, because Caroline straight away recognised the severity of this case, and she pieced all the red flags together to make the picture. So immediately Caroline went out to speak to the community about the disappearance of Banaz. Surely someone must know where she is, right? But not a single member of the community would speak to the police or help them in any way. And in fact, people actually went out of their way to give false accusations or false information in order to throw them off. And they would follow every lead that they were given because they have to. And it would lead them away for weeks at a time to realise, oh, that was false, or that was a dead end. And within days of Banaz being missing, Caroline contacted her sister, Bekhal, where here she actually informed Bekhal that her sister was missing. She didn't know. This was completely the first time that Bekhal had heard of it, but she immediately told Caroline that she didn't believe that nobody knew what was happening. She knew her family had something to do with it, and she told her that her family were completely responsible for her disappearance. And not only did Banaz go to the police prior to this to report her abuse, to say that she was in fear for her life and that she was being followed by her family, but she also wrote a letter. And this letter, it really feels like Banaz was solving her murder before it even happened. So back in December 2005, before her disappearance, she wrote this letter and sent it to the police. And in this letter to police, she spoke about the people that she was convinced were trying to kill her, where she wrote, "Numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5 have said they are ready to kill me. I overheard my uncle say it on the phone. They are going to kill me and my boyfriend Ramat." And from this letter, Caroline was able to identify these numbered men that were mentioned. And 3 of the men that were identified from this letter were Omar Hussein, Muhammad Ali, and Muhammad Hammer. So let's find out what actually happened to Banaz. On the 24th of January 2006, Banaz's father and mother left the house, leaving her alone and vulnerable. And this was done on purpose. Banaz was sleeping on the living room floor at the time because she didn't have a bed and she didn't have her own room, which, again, speaks volumes. Where the 3 men that were mentioned in the letter earlier walked into the house. Now, what we know of her murder, we know because Muhammad Hammer actually recorded conversations of himself boasting about this. He boasted with a sense of, "Look what I did. I removed the shame from the family." Worst of all, he was talking about how long it took her to die. And I hate this so much, but he said, "The bitch's soul was not getting discharged. Muhammad put the cord around her neck, and I stamped on the back of her head. She was vomiting. I took over the cord, and I stamped on the back of her neck. The cord was going deeper and deeper into her skin. It took 5 minutes for her soul to discharge." The boasting, the degrading nature of the way he discusses her as nothing more than a soul to be discharged. Because to him, it was a business deal. And that's the thing about honour killings. They're very collaborative. To be honest, there is nothing honourable about them. And traditionally, I guess for lack of a better word, these are dignified, as they are seen to remove shame from the family. And it's almost seen like a necessity, but also sacrifice one member in sake of all the others. Today in the UK, there are roughly 10 to 15 honour killings a year. However, this number could be much higher than we anticipate, with a lot of this happening abroad, as in UK citizens are being flown abroad to their death. And worldwide, there are 5,000 honour killings a year. And in UK in 2010, 4 years after Banaz's murder, there were 3,000 honour-based crimes in the UK. But it begs the question, in the case of a missing child, who often reports the missing child? It's the family, right? But if the family are responsible for the missing child, are they going to report that the child is missing or their family member is missing? No. And the community aren't going to say anything either because they did what they could. So realistically, there are so many instances of this not getting reported at all and it going completely under the radar. So to get back onto the case, Caroline is working really hard to try and solve this. And she's trying really hard to find anything to pin these 3 specific men in terms of evidence. And with zero help from the community and zero interest from the Mahmod family, she knew that she was solving this case for Banaz. Because normally in a missing person case, which it still was at this point in time, or so we thought, the family would be chasing for an update. They'd be constantly hounding the police, constantly hounding the press, going all over social media to do anything to find their loved one. But the Mahmod family did none of that. And I think that just screams how little respect they had for Banaz as a human being. And her own parents who brought her into this world, just not fussed, because their reputation meant more to them than the safety of their daughter. Finally, in April 2006, 3 months after Banaz went missing, Caroline received a tip about a freezer being over the place where Banaz was buried. Police then actually get a helicopter and fly it over the Mahmod family garden, where here they found a big white case freezer in the garden pushed up against the back of the house. And with this in hand, with the tip-off that they received, they were able to obtain a warrant, where on the 28th of April 2006, they went in and searched the back garden. Instantly, they could see that the earth had recently been disturbed, where they dug and uncovered a suitcase, a black suitcase that had been completely ruined by a burst water pipe. And within this suitcase, placed in a fetal position, was Banaz. And with that, Ari Mahmod, and Mohammed Hammer were arrested. During interviews, Banaz's father and uncle tried to pass the blame onto each other, swearing that they were westernized in their beliefs. And in June 2007, Banaz's father and her uncle were unanimously found guilty, and they were sentenced to life for murder, where they received a minimum 20 and 23-year sentence retrospectively. Mohammed Hammer also pleaded guilty shortly after the start of the trial, and he was also sentenced to life with a minimum of 17 years. Now, you may be wondering, what about the other 2 men that were involved in this that we know of? Well, unfortunately, both of these men had fled back to Iraq, where over in Iraq they were publicly celebrating the fact that they murdered Banaz and that they restored the honour onto their family. Omar Hussein was living with his brother at the time, who was a police officer over in Iraq, and one day they argued, seemingly unrelated to this case, where actually Omar's brother shot him in the leg, so Omar went to hospital, and it was here that he was arrested. And by 2010, Caroline Good and her team managed to extradite both Omar Hussein and Muhammad Ali. It took them over 3 long years, but they did it. And they were the first to achieve extraditing criminals back to the UK from Iraq. Both Omar and Muhammad were sentenced to life sentences, where in November 2010 they both received a minimum of 21 years. A total of 7 men were arrested in connection to Banaz's murder. So those that we've already discussed, we have her father, Mohammed, her uncle, Ari, her cousins, Mohammed Hammer, Muhammad Ali, and Omar Hussein. But there was also Pishtiwan Hammer, who was sentenced with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. He served an unidentified amount of time, but seemingly is out of prison now. But also Dana Amin, who was another cousin of Banaz. Dana actually helped in the process of burying Banaz's body. Dana was sentenced to 8 years, where the full time was served, but he has since been released. And in the documentary that I mentioned earlier, Caroline mentions that she thinks over 50 people were probably actually involved in this murder. Not physically, but they had some involvement in planning or keeping it a secret. And Bekhal actually turned up to the trial and took the stand against her family. She bravely gave statements against all of these men, and she held them accountable. This put her in terrible, terrible danger, but she wanted to honour what was right. And that is what honour truly is about. And she did this despite the fact that she had been receiving death threats from her family, telling her that she was going to be next if she spoke to the police. And Bekhal did go back into hiding after this to keep herself safe. Because frankly, I don't think she's ever going to escape the shame that she brought her family, in quote unquote, by going against them and speaking to the police. And just, massive shout out to Bekhal on this, because she showed up for her sister again and again, time after time. When Banaz had no circle, no group of friends, no support system, but she had a loyal sister who loved her more than anyone else in the world. And I think that's the really sad part about this case. Banaz was so kind and warm and gentle and such a good person, but nobody was there to protect her like she deserved. And in the documentary, they mentioned how not a single photograph of Banaz was up in the Mahmod family home. So to bring that background to our favourite topic of the London Metropolitan Police, a complaint inquiry was held following Banaz's death, where here they discovered absolutely no action was taken after her report to the police. Despite the fact that she reported physical domestic violence and stalking from her family along with death threats, it took them over 3 months to even write up a report, and by that point, she was missing, or as we now know, she was dead. Which I think goes without saying, it's disgusting, heartbreaking that they didn't do anything. Because had they bothered to take that seriously, had they actually done their job and protected her and kept her safe, she may still be here today. And at the end of giving her statement to the police, Banaz asked the officer, like, now that I've told you this, what can you do to keep me safe? What can you do to help me? And she was told, you've given us some positive lines of inquiry, which we can investigate. We'll update you. But they didn't follow these positive lines of inquiry. And at no point did they make sure she was safe. Reach out, update her. It's just, again and again, she was let down by the police on multiple occasions by multiple officers. And it was only after her death where people actually listened to her. From the officer that took the initial statement in the police station to the officer that visited her in the hospital, she was never taken seriously. Honour killings are something that have been around for centuries across multiple races and religions. And it is a really touchy subject still today. And I think there's a huge fear about speaking about it because these beliefs are associated with minority groups of people here in the UK. So people are scared to speak out about it in fear of being branded as racist. But as it's so rightly put in the documentary by Iranian and Kurdish prosecution Diana Nami, she says that the real Kurdish people of the UK don't believe in honour killings. And I agree. You can still be part of a community and part of a race and part of a religion, but recognise that those beliefs are outdated and that there is no honour in honour killings. And it's important to talk about these topics because they still happen today in the UK and worldwide. And this case absolutely changed the way that police are trained to recognise the dangers of honour killings or honour-based violence. And I know this because I went through this training where this specific case was covered quite extensively. Police are now trained to recognise the threat and danger of honour-based violence, and they're expected to take it extremely seriously, no matter on age, race or religion. And again, it's so sad that it had to get to this point in order for this training to occur in the first place. Had they had proper training in the first place, maybe the two officers would have recognised that she was in real danger, but we can't change that now. And I did cover this case in my last podcast, Crime Notes, but I wanted to be able to provide you an example of how the police take these grave mistakes and learn from them. Does that make their mistakes okay? No, nothing ever will make their mistakes okay. And these individuals should be held accountable because they didn't follow through with a law, with a process, with anything that should be done. But should we learn from these experiences? Absolutely. And to round off this case with something positive, I guess, is Caroline Good actually received the Queen's Police Medal in 2011 for the work that she did on solving this case, which I do think is very well deserved because even in death, she looked after Banaz. She solved that case for Banaz because nobody else was going to solve it for her. And she did her absolute best to honour her by solving the case, and I think she did a grand job of that. So there we go, guys. That was the case of Banaz Mahmod. Let's take a breath, shall we? So thanks for sticking around to the end. If you made it through, well done. And thank you for listening to my opinion on these vital cases. As always, I will give you the most rounded and researched approach I possibly can, but it's really important that I get to share my opinion on these, and you guys can then take that away and make your own opinion on it. So make sure you subscribe to keep up to date with my latest video. You can listen to the audio-only version over on Spotify, so I'll link that down below in the description. As always, keep yourself safe and do something nice for yourself today. Treat yourself and drink some water because it's probably been a while since you did that. So I'll catch you next time. Bye.